Hey everyone, Tactics here with a quick refresher guide to Azure Vault in Season 4 of Dragonflight, where I'll be going through the most important trash and boss abilities that you need to know in both Mythic 0 and Mythic Plus Keystones, including any changes that have come with the new season. If you want a full list of abilities or a simple pug Mythic Plus route for the season, check out my ability spreadsheet, my route videos, or my written guides on the Method website, all linked in the description below. Otherwise, let's get straight into it, starting with the whelplings and the mobs encased in stone. So throughout the dungeon, you're going to see these shrieking whelps with a circle around them. These mobs have stealth detection, and basically, if anyone steps into that circle or aggroes them by hitting them, they'll cast Shriek, which will activate any nearby mobs frozen in stone. There is one important mob that can be activated, and that is the Crystal Fury. These guys have a tank-targeted frontal in piercing shards, which cannot be avoided. It will follow the tank, so you'll want to use CCs on this cast to stop it from going off. Tanks, make sure it's pointed away from the group, and if you really need to, you can tank this boss near some of the outcroppings or corners throughout the dungeon, and if you LOS during the cast, it'll avoid the damage entirely. Also, in this beginning area, you'll find Conjured Lasher mobs. These guys have one important cast in Mystic Vapors. You can kick this or stop it with a CC, and you want to because this deals arcane damage and applies a stacking magic dot to the entire party. So make sure as few of these casts go off as possible, and healers, if you do see any go off, dispel when you can and heal through it. Arcane Tenders are the other important mob in this area, and they are lieutenant mobs, so they cannot be CC'd, so you want to use an interrupt on their erratic growth cast. This will target a random player and stun them for 6 seconds by turning them into a tree. This stun is a magic effect, so if you do miss a kick for any reason, healers can dispel this effect. That brings us to the first boss of the dungeon, Leymor, where the name of the game is Flower Management. At the beginning of the fight and each new phase, the boss will throw out a bunch of leyline sprouts that can be destroyed in two ways. First, the tank-targeted Erupting Fissure Frontal will remove any sprouts hit. In terms of positioning for this frontal, I recommend putting the boss slightly off-center in the room, and then you point the frontal through the sprout spawns in the middle of the room, and hopefully they also hit the edges of that side of the room as well. Tanks, you can no longer avoid this frontal either. You were able to avoid it in Season 1. That is no longer true, so you have to use a defensive here. The other way to clear flowers is with Explosive Brand. When this is cast, it deals damage to anyone within 12 yards of the boss, so melee, make sure you step away, and it also knocks players back. You'll get a debuff on you that is a circle that explodes after 6 seconds after this happens, and basically any flowers hit by this circle will also be destroyed. So when this cast happens, have your group spread out and hit any remaining flowers. Note that when a flower is destroyed, it will spawn a volatile sapling mob which explodes on death, so make sure tanks are ready to pick these up. At the end of each phase, the boss does a pretty big party hit in Consuming Stomp, which deals more damage for each sprout remaining, which is why you want to do your best to remove as many of these as possible from the fight. There's also a pretty nasty tank buster on this fight in Infused Strike, so tanks, you really want to make sure if you have to defensive one of the frontal or Infused Strike is definitely the more important. After every Consuming Stomp, the boss will spawn more flowers, and the fight just repeats from there. Moving towards the ring area of the dungeon, you'll find a bunch of arcane elementals. These guys now only have a single cast in Waking Bane, which is interruptible and stoppable with a CC, and it'll put a random target to sleep for 10 seconds. Again, a magic debuff, so if you miss any of the interrupts or stops here, you can dispel it if it's not on your healer. The real number one important spell you want to prevent is Icy Bindings here. Rune Seal Keepers will cast this ability, and it is interruptible or stoppable with the CC again, and it's a big AoE frost hit that also roots the entire party. So you really want to make sure this doesn't go off, because there's a bunch of other frontals and swirlies and other stuff going on that can be really dangerous if you are rooted. Speaking of frontals, Arcane Constructs have a frontal in this area. This is Arcane Bash. This one does not lock in on the tank's position, so it just is stationary once the frontal starts. So tanks, point this away from your group and make sure you do sidestep it, because it does knock back and you do not want to get knocked off the platform. Also, for tanks to be aware of in the next boss's room are Vault Guards. These guys have a pretty nasty tank buster in Ice Cutter, which deals both frost and physical damage. Not super dangerous on its own, but there's a lot of these mobs in this area, so if you pull too many of them, you could be in trouble. Use stops on this if you can. It is quite a fast cast, so just be aware of it. What's really dangerous is the Scalebane Lieutenant mini-boss in this area. This guy's immune to CC, and he has an aura around him in Mage Hunter's Fervor, which increases the damage done of all mobs by 25%. So again, if you have a lot of Vault Guards in here, the Ice Cutters can get quite dangerous, and also, this guy also Ice Cutters on his own, so be aware of that. He also has a nasty tank frontal in Spellfrost Breath. This frontal, again, will follow you, but because it has that shorter range, you can jump out if you have any sort of mobility and avoid the damage entirely. After clearing this room, you can take on the second boss, Azureblade, who alternates between a boss phase and an intermission phase, where the latter begins when the boss gets to 0 energy. For the boss phase, tanks need to be aware of where the boss is facing, as there is another frontal here in Arcane Cleave. This follows you but is only 10 yards long, so again, if you have the mobility, you can jump out of the way, otherwise just use a defensive. Outside of that, the boss will occasionally shoot out an arcane orb in a line at a random player, which you just need to dodge, and will also intermittently spawn a draconic image, which will spam cast illusionary bolt at random players. You either need to keep this mob interrupted, or you can hard CC these ads as well. Just any kind of CC will work, so stuns or even long-term CCs such as blind also work. If you are planning to kill these, make sure you do drag the boss over, but again, watch out for that cleave timing. On death, these mobs will shoot out 3-yard swirlies called unstable magic, so make sure you are dodging them. For the intermission phase, the boss is going to run to the center of the room and begin to cast Overwhelming Energy, which on successful casts makes her immune to damage and causes ticking damage to occur every 2.5 seconds until you defeat all 4 of the Draconic Illusion mobs that have spawned around her. At the same time, smaller Ancient Orb fragments will constantly be flung out from the center of the room. Just make sure you avoid those, and just like the images in the boss phase, once you kill an illusion, some of those unstable magic swirlies are going to spawn as well, so make sure your dancing shoes are on. Once all 4 of the illusions are defeated, you return to the boss phase and repeat from there. Moving into the last section of trash of the dungeon, there's really only one super important mob left, and that is the Draconid Breaker, another lieutenant mob, so immune to CC. And this guy's got the reworked Shoulder Slam ability, which will target a random player and now do an 8-yard physical AoE around them and apply a 10% physical damage taken increase for 12 seconds. This can be shadow melted off if you are one of those classes or any other kind of combat drop like Vanish or Feign, but pretty dangerous hit, especially when combined with the AoE that shortly follows in Bestial Roar, which deals physical damage. If you are a range player, it is possible to actually get out of range of this ability because it's only a 30-yard AoE, but you don't want to be too far because you don't want the frogs in this area to also jump super far away from the pack. After you defeated the final area of trash, you'll be able to take another book to travel to Telash Greywing's platform, which is a fight that heavily emphasizes good positioning. Frost bombs will go on every single player and do a 5-yard cleave around them and leave behind frozen ground puddles that last for 2.5 minutes. So placement of these is very important. You want to make sure that you aren't blocking off other players with your puddle. Plus, you want to make sure that you don't cover any of the unused vault runes on the ground, as you'll need your group to stack in these to gain the 50% DR they provide when the boss jumps away at 100 energy and casts absolute 0. I recommend dropping the very first set of frost bombs just before the vault rune that the boss starts near, as there's only one cast of this ability before the first absolute 0, and that kind of sets up your positioning for the rest of the fight. Know that once a vault rune has been used, it also needs around 2 minutes to actually charge back up, so you'll be rotating around this room in a circle, leaving puddles behind you as you go from rune to rune. Other than that, the boss will occasionally just channel Icy Devastator on a random player, which deals splash damage to anyone within 8 yards, but know this ability, again, can be stopped with combat drops, so Vanish, Invis, Feign, Shadow Meld, all those things can be quite useful here to mitigate some damage. Once you've defeated Telash, you'll be able to jump down immediately and head to the final boss of the dungeon, Umbrelskul, with no trash in the way. Like all dragons, of course, there is a breath attack in Crystalline Roar. This just shoots out a line at a random player, so make sure you sidestep this. There's also a big tank buster in Dragon Strike, so make sure you pop a defensive for this hit. And healers, make sure you dispel the magic dot that applies ASAP. There's nothing else tanks need to worry about on this fight, really, so use all your defensives and rotate through them on these hits. On top of this, the boss will sometimes spawn 4 crackling vortexes, which are 7 yards orbs that patrol in random patterns near where they were spawned. These deal heavy damage if you touch one, so once the area of the room that you are in starts getting too many of these, it's a good idea to do a big movement to an open space. I prefer initially taking the boss towards one of the sides of the room and just kind of split the room into thirds in my head, moving to the next third after a couple spawns of these vortexes. There's also a big unavoidable hit in Unleashed Destruction, which also has a knockback attached to it, so make sure you are topped for this hit. Use a defensive if necessary, and just watch your positioning so that you don't get knocked into any of the crackling vortexes. Outside of that, at 75%, 50%, and 25% HP, the boss will spawn 5 detonating crystals around himself, interrupting whatever he's doing in the process. These crystals have a 20-second cast in Fracture, which, if successful, will deal an extremely nasty 15-second dot to the entire party, so you want to immediately swap to these mobs and kill them as quickly as possible. On top of these, one of the crystals specifically will be hardened, giving an additional absorb shield and causing it to pulse for arcane damage every second that shield persists. So swap to this crystal specifically first, get that shield down, and then cleave all of the crystals evenly before the cast finishes. Again, taking the boss towards one of the edges of the room can actually be useful here because it can spawn the crystals a little bit closer together, making them easier to cleave. But there we have it, guys. That's my refresher guide to Azure Vault in Season 4 of Dragonflight. Hopefully this was helpful to you, and if it was, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like it. Otherwise, shout out to my Patreon supporters for making this content possible, and I'll see you all in the next video.